Today I want to talk about receiving. My aim is to lift up the value, the virtue, and the goodness of receptivity. My inspiration and much of the source material comes from my late and close colleague, Roy Phillips' 1985 Berry Street lecture on just this subject, receptivity. A brief look through the hymn book, both of them, but either of them, but I'm more familiar with this one. And through other UU hymnals, I have about 6 dating back to the 19th century as well. All of them reveals that this topic, receptivity, sort of goes against the grain of most liberal religious teaching. It's true. We Unitarian Universalists tend to perceive ourselves as makers and shakers, doers and givers and helpers, and it is strongly reflected here. Judith Walker Riggs, a highly regarded senior colleague of mine, now retired, points out that this is fascinatingly one-sided. And I quote her, sort of ignores reality. The reality that as infants we survive only by receiving. The reality that in old age we will survive only by receiving. The reality that now we only survive by receiving. As we sang moments ago in the opening hymn, I walk the unfrequented road with open eye and ear. I watch afield the farmer load the bounty of the year. I filch the fruit of no man's toil, no trespasser am I. And yet I reap from every soil and from the unmeasured sky. I gather where I did not sow, and bind the mystic sheaf, the amber air, the river's flow, the rustle of the leaf. I face the hills, the stream, the wood, and feel with all akin. My heart expands, their fortitude and peace and joy flow in. Both the Redwood City UU Fellowship and the San Francisco Unitarian Society, 2 of the more recent interim ministries that I led or did or accomplished, both of them were proud that the late philosopher Alan Watts had preached to their congregations back in the 60s, Watts 3 or 4 times in San Francisco and once in Redwood City. I mention this because Alan Watts appealed to California UUs and preached among us. He was in many ways one of us. Long before he became a household name among the counterculture, he was known to Bay Area UUs. In his autobiography, Alan Watts describes a 1958 meeting with Carl Jung at the psychiatrist's home in Switzerland. Walking along the water's edge of Lake Geneva, and in response to the 83-year-old's many questions, Watts had the temerity to suggest that the term, the unconscious, was unfortunate, since psychic processes, indeed all processes, are more verb-like than nounish. Jung agreed. Their conversation continued. It's not just consciousness versus unconsciousness that's going on inside the psyche. There's something else, too, a differentiation between what we call the scanning deliberative mind and the creative unconscious. The scanning deliberative mind, what Cal State Hayward historian Theodore Rorschach and others have called our objective manipulative consciousness, is to be distinguished from the creative unconscious. Physician Andrew Weil refers to the creative unconscious as the natural mind. My late UU colleague Roy Phillips called it the spontaneous mind. Call it what you will. The important thing is to find a way to express and thereby more fully notice the truth that in our experience, our existential reality experience, there is a spontaneous functioning and inner kaleidoscope that is constantly turning and churning up new patterns. We can block this out of our awareness, or we can foster within ourselves an attitude of receptivity to it. In the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson, I am constrained every moment to acknowledge a higher origin for events than the will I call mine. As with events, so with thoughts and feelings. When I watch the flowing river, I see that I am not a cause, but a surprised spectator of this ethereal water. That I desire to look up and put myself in an attitude of reception, but from some alien energy, the visions come. One of religion's primary functions, I believe, has been to advocate that we become ever more receptive to our inner, natural, spontaneous mind, what Emerson here describes as an ethereal inner river. Down through the centuries and across cultures, much in religious myth and ritual encourages the faithful to open up to the creative activity of their own natural mind. This creativity, this inner river, is operative within us, but it has a life of its own. We cannot control it. We must allow it to be and try to cultivate a passive receptivity to its creative working. 31 years ago, in August of 1986, so 31 years in a few months, I had a remarkable experience. My then 6-year-old daughter and I had just come back from a 10-day camping trip to Acadia National Park up near Bar Harbor, Maine. And we had stopped on our way back to Connecticut for a 2-day visit with friends in Belfast, Maine, on the edge of Penobscot Bay. The early morning light streaming through the window awakened me. And after a moment's hesitation, I put something on, went out to the front porch, and quietly, calmly watched the sunrise. I say calmly because after nearly 2 weeks outdoors and on vacation, I was able to sit and watch without thinking all the while about the 1,000,001 things I had to do, favors I owned, slights I'd received, and all the other claptrap inner nonstop dialogue that usually fills our heads, certainly mine. Across the wide waters, fishing and lobster boats plied their way to the open sea. Waterfowl glided by. Billowy clouds modulated shades of pink, orange, and purple reflected in the gently waving bay. It was a glorious morning. As I watched, I paid ever so slight attention to my breathing. Suddenly I realized what the breathing exercises so important to yoga are all about. You spend months and years learning how to breathe in one nostril and out the other, to slow breathing, to pace it, manipulate it, discipline it. And the paradoxical intent of such discipline is to show you at last, to show you with world-shattering, mindset-demolishing impact the momentous truth that all along you had missed, that you do not breathe, that the fundamental existential truth is rather that breathing happens in you. You do not ultimately control it. The truth is not I breathe. The truth is rather I am breathed. Something beyond the controlling self, something beyond the ego, is at work within me. Something beyond within me. Something simultaneously within and beyond. Some it breathing me, some thou. The beyond is within me. When I am awake, when I am asleep, it breathes itself through me. It breathes me. And beyond this, it lives me. It is up to me to develop a full receptivity to its life within me. When I can do this, become fully receptive to the natural, spontaneous mind within, I will live as a fully integrated human being at one with myself and the world. Openness to the beyond within, this is not cultivated enough among us, especially in this day and age. Instead, we are pressured to keep our eyes hard focused on a publicly agreed upon external world all of us hold in common. To that outer world, we are constantly urged to pay attention, serious attention, with no navel gazing. But just for the fun of it, let's stop for a moment and think about that. No navel gazing. Navel gazing, a term used to refer to the wasted time spent by a self-absorbed narcissist. In our age, contemplating one's navel is seen as an enormous waste of energy. Yet just for a moment, truly, contemplate your navel. Your navel, ponder it. It is scar tissue from your original primal connection. Even after the umbilical cord is cut, no one is on his or her own. No longer dependent on an individual mother, the newborn begins her or his unmediated direct dependence on, instead, an entire nexus of others. Community, culture, traditions, ecosystem, the plenitude, the mystery of being. Were we to allow ourselves to engage in navel gazing, we might be more aware of our continuing status, no matter how much we also give our continuing status forever as receivers. Many of the symbols and practices of religion, I believe, have as their subliminal intent the cultivation of an open receptivity toward the workings of the beyond outside ourselves, surely, but even more the beyond within. Interestingly, religious myth and symbol usually advocates trust toward and faith in this beyond, whereas conventional wisdom urges caution. For example, psychoanalysis refers to the unconscious, spontaneous mind as the id. It urges caution when approaching what it considers the rapacious seat of infantile craving and sexual desire. Religion, by and large, is kinder, urging trust in the natural mind with references to the presence of the Holy Spirit within. No doubt, many of you here saw the highly acclaimed play or the movie Amadeus, about the life of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and his anguished contemporary Antonio Salieri. One of the show's most vivid scenes has Salieri looking over some manuscripts of Mozart's music, which at first he took to be copies, only to suddenly realize that in fact what he was looking at were drafts, first and only drafts. The scene dramatizes what Mozart himself reported of his own inner experience as he wrote scores. In the movie, Salieri spoke of the music Mozart heard in his head as the voice of God sounding within. Call it what you will. The testimony clearly demonstrates the artistic and creative value of cultivating one's receptivity to the workings of the inner mind. A friend of mine, the late Dr. Art Gladman, was the owner and director of an Oakland rehabilitation hospital and a pioneer biofeedback researcher. Having conducted biofeedback experiments with thousands of patients, Art told me that those most successful at adapting his techniques were artists, especially musicians, particularly jazz musicians. For these musicians, the art of spontaneous composition, what makes authentic jazz jazz, is the practice of just listening to the spontaneous mind within and simultaneously playing what you hear. Or as Dr. Gladman, the scientist, put it, tuning out the beta waves and tuning into alpha and gamma. Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright August Wilson grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Wilson wrote his first plays there, but his artistic breakthrough did not come until 1978, when he moved away from the Hill, Pittsburgh's historic African-American community, to St. Paul, Minnesota. Some of you may have seen the movie last year, I think it was out, Fences, with Viola Davis won the Academy Award, and it was directed by Denzel Washington, who played across from her. It was an excellent movie. Well, but what I want to point out was that August Wilson's from the Hill District in Pittsburgh, and then in the 70s, I think it was, late 70s, he moved to St. Paul, Minnesota. In doing so, Wilson left a neighborhood that had 55,000 black people for a state that had about the same number. There weren't many black folk around, he wrote. In that silence, I could hear the language for the first time. I could hear the music. Not only have artists learned how to do this, many top scientists have described the experience of scientific discovery in roughly similar terms. The German chemist Friedrich Kekule's discovery of the benzene molecule is a classic case. Kekule had spent years wrestling with the structure of the molecule but could not figure it out. Then one afternoon, he pushed his papers aside and lay his head down for a nap, whereupon he dreamed of an Ouroboros, which is the mythological image of a snake swallowing its own tail, sometimes a dragon. And as he came out of dreamland with that image in his mind and into consciousness, Kekule knew immediately and intuitively that this was his answer. The carbon atoms took a ring, not a chain formation. And the years of research and struggle were solved. Then there's the example of the poet William Blake. In two 1803 letters to a friend, Blake commented on a poem he had recently completed. He writes, "I have written this poem for immediate dictation, 12 or sometimes 20 or 30 lines at a time, without premeditation and even against my will. The time it has taken in writing was thus rendered non-existent, and an immense poem exists which seems to be the labor of a long life, all produced without labor or study. I may praise it, since I dare not pretend to be other than the secretary. The authors are in eternity." Blake's poem came to him. He did not work it into being. He was the recording secretary. He wrote down what he received. The authors are in eternity. or were in eternity, beyond him, beyond his conscious control. Whatever else it means to say the authors are in eternity, I take it to mean at least that the creative unconscious, the spontaneous mind, is the source of the poem. I'm concerned that some may protest that I speak of receiving, as I've been urging us to do, that to do so will encourage a self-centered, narcissistic life stance. But I don't think so. It seems to me instead that it grounds us by providing a more honest and realistic and less grandiose picture of ourselves as beings who oscillate continually between dependence and independence, between waking and sleeping, between giving and receiving. And there are those who will voice the fear that if we urge people to be more trusting of the spontaneous mind, we will be allowing and encouraging licentiousness and violence and unleashing us, all of us, to become murderers and rapists. No, I think otherwise. For while surely there are murderers and rapists in the world, they are not us. Certainly not the vast majority of us. Let the murderers and rapists be guarded. We ought not to mute our spirits because there are evil persons and processes in the world. Most of us, I'm quite certain, are more likely to become dangerous to ourselves and to others when we bind ourselves in, when we tone ourselves down, when we mute and restrain. This, I guess, is the question. Is it the dangerous id or the presence of the vaulted Holy Spirit stirring there inside our hearts of hearts? My answer, I contend, is fully continuous with the teachings of our tradition, which holds to a belief in a spark, a touch of the divine within each person. There is a deep wisdom there, which is greater than we think. In our lives and in our work, we are the locus of creative impulses whose origins are lost in the mystery beyond us. We are here to do the bidding of this creativity, to learn to wait for it receptively, and to struggle bringing it to expression. So may it be. Namaste and amen.